welcome to EWTN's Remembering Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI special from Rome. I'm Catherine Hadro. Thank you for joining us. In tonight's special, we will be bringing clarity and context to the life and legacy of Pope Benedict XVI, who at the age of 95 died on Saturday, December 31st. His funeral will be this Thursday, January 5th, and we will be bringing complete coverage of that historic event. Programming details can be found at EWTN.com/Benedict. But we begin our special coverage tonight, and our hope is this week you too can come to know Pope Benedict XVI even greater through our reports, discussions, and interviews. I'll be joined all week with my esteemed panel, and I'll introduce you to them now. Dr. Matthew Benson is Executive Editor and Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief of EWTN News. Father Raymond D'Souza is a priest in Ontario, Canada, in the Archdiocese of Kingston. He's also a contributor to the National Catholic Register. And Father Roger Landry is currently a Catholic chaplain to Columbia University in New York City. He previously was in the diplomatic service for the Holy See at the United Nations. All three panelists here regularly write for the National Catholic Register. There's so much to discuss as we enter into this week, as we've all arrived in Rome. It's obviously a solemn occasion, but there is something to be said about the joy of coming together as a Catholic family and remembering Pope Benedict.
St. Paul told the first Christians in Thessalonica words that are still very much relevant to us, Catherine, that we Christians grieve, but we grieve differently than everybody else because we grieve with hope. And Pope Benedict, when he came to the United States in 2008, his whole message was about Christian hope. And he wrote that we've got to have the great hope for eternal life with the Lord. And so as we mourn, we're likewise grateful, and we pray that that great hope that he tried to inspire in the Church Universal, he has now had fulfilled in his own life.
Absolutely. I want to share with our viewers some details about this week and the funeral and what we know. The death of Benedict was not announced in St. Peter's Square, nor was there the normal ringing of the bells. The Vatican press office says the funeral will be simple in accordance to Pope Benedict's wishes. His body originally stayed in his residence until January 2nd, where it was then brought to St. Peter's Basilica so the faithful could honor and pray with him. And I think it was estimated 65,000 pilgrims paid their respects yesterday. We saw those lines staying busy and continuing throughout the day, and also had the opportunity to pray with Pope Benedict. Father D'Souza, if you could put into context for us the unique nature of this week and Pope Benedict's funeral.
Well, in short, the context is that there has never been a context like this, and for a rare time, unique actually means what it does, in that this is the singular occasion. There have only been a handful of resignations of the papacy in the history of the Church. All of them involved some kind of crisis around the papacy. So Benedict's abdication in 2013 was, in my view, utterly without precedent because there was no crisis around the papacy. Which means that his funeral will also be unique in that his successor will celebrate the funeral. Previous popes who resigned, they weren't really very welcome back in Rome, so there was no funeral with honor. Celestine V, who died in 1296, I believe, he was imprisoned in house arrest by his successor, so there were no honors to be had. So what we're going to see on Thursday is something that no Catholic has ever seen in the history of the Church, which doesn't happen very often. That being said, a Catholic funeral is a Catholic funeral. Viewers who remember St. John Paul's funeral, there are certain things different for a pope, but they would have recognized it. It looks just like a Catholic funeral mass. The prayers are a little different because it's a pope, but if you've been to a Catholic funeral mass in your local parish, you'll recognize this. Some of the international diplomatic dimensions of a papal funeral will not be taking place because Pope Emeritus Benedict was emeritus. He's not the Pope. And so all of that sort of head of state business that went on will not take place this time.
That's right. We do know that Pope Francis will preside over the funeral mass, and I believe just 2 delegations coming to the funeral as well.
Officially at this point, yes. It's worth noting, too, to pick up on something that Father is talking about. We don't have what are called the Novum Dialis. We don't have the 9 days of mourning. We also didn't have the telegram that went out to all of the cardinals around the world to come to Rome. We're going to have a lot of cardinals here. But what is also the normal function after a papal funeral is not going to take place, and that is a conclave. We have a sitting pope. So again, to your point, Father, this is fundamentally unique in church history.
One of the interesting things will be to see whether Pope Francis actually celebrates Mass or not. With the exception of Easter Sunday, he's been unable to celebrate Mass this year. He's there, he presides, as said, but someone else actually says the Mass at the altar, offers the Eucharist. It'll be interesting to see whether he makes an effort. He's had trouble with his walking and mobility, but it might be interesting to see if he, for this a special occasion, presides at the altar offering the Mass as he did. I think the last time was Easter Sunday, actually, I think it was.
You know, this week is such a beautiful opportunity for us in the church to come and learn and know Pope Benedict XVI in a greater way. I know I've been just reading more about him than I ever have in my life, and I never had the opportunity to meet him, and yet he was our Holy Father, and there is such a love for him. But if I have it right, I believe all three of you have each met Pope Benedict, and I'd love to just share those insights you've each had. Father Landry.
So I first read the Ratzinger Report, which was a book-length interview with Vittorio Messori my freshman year in college, 1988, 3 years after it had come out. And I said, I have to get to know him better. That's really what started my reading so many of his works. And when I finally arrived in Rome in 1995 as a seminarian, I said that there were two people I really want to meet, St. John Paul II, for obvious reasons, but then Cardinal Ratzinger. And so older men at the Pontifical North American College would regularly go to his Mass at the Teutonic College in the Vatican. So with them, I went to meet him for the first time. He very cordially greeted us at the end, welcomed us when he found out that we were seminarians here in Rome, and very much encouraged us. And then, as I like to say, from that point forward, I would ambush him according to his very precise daily habits in St. Peter's Square, where I'd walk across to his office and back from his office, as well as outside the back of his apartment, where every day at 4 p.m. he would exit to pray his rosary down the Borgo Pio. And so he started to come onto the pattern that about a dozen times I was out there coincidentally at 4 p.m. and he asked that question, why is it, Father Landry, that you're always out here at 4? I said, well, after a big pranzo, I've got to take a walk too, Eminence.
That's amazing. And Father De Souza, you've had the chance to meet him as well.
I did. Contrary-wise to my good friend here, I was invited. I didn't ambush him. But I met him in his retirement. I was very blessed with EWTN and other occasions to cover the historic trip to Great Britain, to the Holy Land, to the United States. But in terms of a personal meeting, at the chaplaincy where I was at the time, I had commissioned a painting of that great scene from October 22nd, 1978. That is John Paul's inaugural Mass, the Be Not Afraid homily, and all the cardinals greeted him, and there's obviously an image of John Paul and Ratzinger, and in that image is 35 years of church history in terms of the pontificate. So I had the image made, and I took a copy of it because the original couldn't be transported. And I wrote to the household, and I was told to come and meet the Holy Father. And Pope Benedict, in his retirement, for top-tier guests, would meet them in the monastery where he lived. Okay. For lower-tier guests, we would go out to the grottos where he would pray his rosary in that day with his older brother, Monsignor Georg, and these two 80-year-olds walking, praying the rosary. Well, he was in a wheelchair, Georg. And I showed him the image, and of course he recognized the image. And in the background were moments from his homily, 27 years later, from when he preached the homily for John Paul. And it was very beautiful, and it was sentimental to him a bit, and he blessed it. But interestingly, the questions he asked us were, what are you studying? What are you reading? What did you do your studies in? So
always a professor.
He was a professor. He was interested in the moment, and there was obviously some real sentiment. But the questions he actually asked us were about our studies. And I was already graduated, but he wanted to know what I studied and whether I was keeping up with my reading, I guess.
That's so insightful. And Matthew, you've had chance meetings with him in Rome, am I correct?
Absolutely, just chance. I don't have the fun of the stories of my two colleagues here, especially, I'm apparently not top tier, middle tier, or any other kind of tier. I met him over here in the piazza, just walking. I didn't plan it either, so we'll put it that way. Just walking as he was wont to do with the beret and the suitcase, the briefcase. But even just to be able to pass him to thank him just to shake his hand. He was very kind, but it was so brief as to be, frankly, unremarkable in terms of his life, but certainly in my life, to be able to meet someone of his stature. I can remember as a very young man trying to read some of his works, Introduction to Christianity, for example. I stress the word trying to read his works. And then to sort of progress in my understanding to some degree of his writings as I got older and a little better educated and a little more aware of the world and the church. To grow in that, to use him as a constant touchstone for what I would want my own theology, my own formation to be, it was life-altering.
Absolutely.
If I add one thing, a lot of people met him in Rome in restaurants because he did used to eat out. And the night he was elected, April 19th, 2005, there was a restaurant not far from where we are where he went often. And I stopped there on the way back home that night after doing the coverage to congratulate them. And I said, you must have, because they had a lot of pictures of their famous clients. I said, you must have a picture of Cardinal Ratzinger here. And the lady there said, we don't. We took pictures of everybody, but we never asked to take a picture of him because it seemed kind of beneath his dignity.
Wow.
Which he would have agreed, but they knew in a certain sense he wasn't one just like all the others.
That's incredible. Well, I never had the chance to meet him, so I love just hearing these insights and getting to hear more of his personality. I just remember the first time I ever saw him was on EWTN when he was elected Pope. And, I was in 8th grade in my religion class watching that, and I remember that. And then in high school, first time I came to Rome, stumbled upon the general audience here, and it was Pope Benedict. And I will confess, as a teenager at the time, I wanted to see JP too. He was the Pope I had grown up with and was familiar with. Who was this Pope Benedict? And I think that will be such a part of his legacy as well, this humility that Benedict had to follow John Paul II as well. And I know we'll be speaking about his humility throughout the week and just what we've come to know about his personality. But again, today I'm just reflecting on the opportunity we had to pray in front of Pope Benedict here in St. Peter's Basilica.
We were able to get in there rather quickly this morning, thanks be to God, and praying through some guardian angels of the people who were controlling access to the area right on the side of his casket. We were able to get there and pray for about 10 minutes, kneeling in the front row right next to him. And for me, it was one of the more moving experiences of my life because I owe so much to him. His ideas and his example as a priest and then as a leader of the church have fundamentally formed me. And to just be there a few feet away from him, thanking God for him, thanking him for his lifetime of yeses, and to be blunt, praying through his intercession for the church he loved and served for 95 years, as well as for all those who I hope are going to be touched by his funeral this Thursday, was just an extraordinary gift that I want to ascribe to his intercession.
Yes, absolutely. How was that for you, Matthew, to be in the Basilica?
Well, we've had the death of John Paul II in 2005, where the line stretched quite literally all the way across the Tiber into the Centro Storico. It's a little more reserved here, but there is the same feeling that a colossus has passed, and this is our opportunity to go and pray for him, to ask for his prayers, but also to take a moment to reflect on the gift that he was to the church, but also the gift that he was to the world. And I think that's one of those takeaways, too, of that intimacy that prayer can give us, but a recognition, too, that this is a solemn moment, but it is, as you said, right at the start of our conversation tonight, a moment for us to have that Christian joy, the Christian hope that Benedict talked so often about.
Yes, absolutely. And again, throughout our coverage this week, we'll be speaking about his legacy, his greatest contributions. But something that has been reported were that his last words were, "Lord, I love you." And I mean, there are parallels there to St. Therese of Lisieux as well. What has struck you just about this week being here in Rome, hearing about his final days? I mean, it was less than a week ago that Pope Francis shared in the general audience asking us to pray because he was very sick. And I think the whole world, the church really kind of went on standby for what that meant. And
Well, one of the things is, Matthew mentions it's a little different atmosphere. I mean, he's been retired for 10 years. He's 95 years old. repeatedly when he's spoken, which has not been often, but when he has spoken in his retirement, he's often mentioned the end is coming near. Maybe the end is near. I'm going to face my judge. I'm not afraid because I trust in the mercy of God. So, in a sense, the week of this week was the final preparation, but in a way, the way he lived the last 10 years of his life is a good model for how elderly people, of which there are a great number in the world today, should prepare. He was ready, and in a certain sense, the atmosphere here is not that sad. I mean, it's not a shock or a tragedy when a 95-year-old man dies, especially one who is not afraid and who wishes to go where, or believes he's going in God's grace, where he's always wanted to go. So I'd say that's a different dynamic here than elsewhere.
In his first homily as Pope, the day after he was elected, he finished by something that Catholic priests pray all the time called the Te Deum. And the very end of that hymn of praise to the Lord is, In te Domine speravi non confundere in aeternum. In you, Lord, I have hoped. My hope will never be in vain. And he died on December 31st, and every December 31st, from 2005 through 2012, he held a Te Deum service for the last day of the year in St. Peter's Basilica. In several of those last homilies of the year, he came back to that same phrase with which he began his entire pontificate. For me, that great inclusion from the beginning of his pontificate to the end of his life was remarkable, that the Lord had made an appointment before he said at the beginning of time, let there be light, to come get him on that day in which his last words would be, in a sense, in you, Lord, I have hoped, and I will never be hoping in vain.
That's beautiful.
His baptismal name, Joseph. We are honoring the life of Joseph Ratzinger, and we can talk more about that. But here we have a perfect model of emulating St. Joseph, the patron saint of a good death. And I think Fathers Benedict XVI had about as good a death as we can ask for in the Christian faith.
He was ready, and one might say eager. One of his last public statements was from last February, and you got the sense that that he was ready and was eager, if we can say, in a Christian way. I was saying before we came on, my godmother, my aunt, died at 99 and a half not long ago, and she, for the last 15 years of her life, a deeply faithful woman, was asking why is the Lord delaying? And although I don't know that Pope Benedict said that, my sense is that the delay, he would not have wanted a longer delay than was absolutely necessary.
I know, you mentioned his death on December 31st, and Father D'Souza, you recently wrote an article about the liturgical connection to Pope Benedict's life. A little bit later in the program, we'll be watching a report on his childhood, but he was born on Holy Saturday and baptized on Easter Sunday. Is that correct? Well,
he was baptized at that time in 1927 when he was born. The Easter Vigil that we're familiar with in the evening was actually celebrated in the morning. So he was born Holy Saturday morning and taken to the church a few hours later, and the Easter Vigil had already been celebrated. We don't do that now, but it was done that way. So he was baptized in the new Easter water, and the last birthday of his life, his 95th birthday last April, was also Holy Saturday. So there's these providential symmetries there. If I had listened to Father Landry before I'd written that article, I would have included it today, but I didn't, so thank you for that.
Well, on that note, let's take a look at Joseph Ratzinger's childhood.
Joseph Aloysius Ratzinger was born on April the 16th, 1927, in Marktal am Inn, a small German town belonging to the district of Waldtauting in Upper Bavaria. It was Holy Saturday, and his parents decided to baptize him the very next day, Easter Sunday. Little Joseph was the third child of Joseph Ratzinger, a police officer, and Maria Rieger, a housewife. His older siblings, Maria and Georg, would be ever present during the different stages of the life of their younger brother. In 1937, when Joseph was 10, his father retired, and the family moved to the town of Hufschlag in Traunstein, close to the Austrian border, almost 20 miles from Salzburg. Ratzinger would remember this little city as his true home. In 1939, at 12 years of age, Joseph entered minor seminary in Traunstein. where he would stay until 1942, the year in which the Nazi regime closed the seminary and destined it for military use. But the period of his youth was not easy. The Nazi regime cultivated a climate of strong hostility toward the Catholic Church. Only his faith and education from his family would help him to confront the difficult experience of those times. From March of 1939 until 1945, the law on the Hitler Youth forced all young people between 14 and 18 years of age to sign up for its ranks. Young Ratzinger didn't escape this fate. In 1941, upon reaching 14 years of age, Joseph entered the Nazi youth movement against his will and continued his mandatory attendance despite the closing of the seminary in 1942. It was precisely in this scenario where the young Ratzinger would discover the beauty and truth of the faith in Christ. In his memoirs, then Cardinal Ratzinger would underscore the fundamental role of his family, which was ever a clear witness to kindness and hope.
I love seeing those photos of a young Ratzinger. Father Landry, you happen to know of a story about Ratzinger's childhood that probably was very formative in his spiritual life.
In 1932, the Cardinal Archbishop of Munich-Freising, Cardinal Faulhaber was his name, came to Markt am Ill, which is where he was born, in order to do a whole bunch of confirmations. There was so much pageantry, and the young Joseph Ratzinger was captivated by the vestments and the mannerisms of Cardinal Faulhaber, and he returned home later that day and he told his family, when I grow up, I want to become a cardinal. Now, that's the same type of thing that Father Raymond and I would have with the priesthood in general. It just so happened that Cardinal Faulhaber, that priest, was likewise a prince of the apostles. But that experience, of course, that desire would actually occur, not that just that he would be a priest, but that he would become a bishop and a cardinal, and then the Archbishop in Munich-Freising. It's incredible. Beyond that, Cardinal Faulhaber was the one who gave him the gifts of the Holy Spirit at confirmation, and then ordained him as a priest years later. And so from that chance episode, according to the eyes of the world, but providential episode, his relationship with the priest who first inspired his priestly vocation and then filled him with the Holy Spirit so that he'd be able to be docile to what God wanted to do with his life as an instrument, and then sealed him with the gift of the priesthood. That all happened at a very young age, so that when he was ordained 19 years after this scene, he already was ordained with 19 years of experience looking at the world through someone who would become a future priest, bishop, cardinal, and eventually successor of St. Peter.
That's incredible. And I imagine, just thinking back to how quickly he was baptized as a newborn, I imagine there are special graces involved with that as well.
It was more common then, but yes, but he even as an old man said that the experience of being baptized in the fresh Easter water was formative for his spirituality. But it was still Holy Saturday, which said that's who I am, not just their yet. I would mention those beautiful pictures we saw. His older brother, Georg, was ordained a priest. The same ceremony, June 29th, Peter and Paul, 1951. So those two brothers, between them, had 140 years of priesthood. Astonishing.
And remained close friends throughout their life.
Well, and it's an indicator, too. We can see in the life of Joseph Ratzinger, but also in the life of Georg Ratzinger and their sister, that this was a family. I'm reminded, you mentioned Therese of Lisieux.
Right.
This was a deeply Catholic family in a deeply Catholic part of Germany, in Bavaria. And the family, we'll talk more about the suffering of the family, especially his father. But that close-knit quality, grounded in the faith, was something that remained through all of their lives. After their parents had long deceased, Georg, their sister, Joseph, hung together. They were together as siblings, loving each other, caring about each other. And to the point where, if we remember, when Georg Ratzinger died not too many years ago, there was real concern or assumption that his brother, Joseph, Benedict XVI, would not live long because they had all been together and so tight together.
Well, the plan, Cardinal Ratzinger's plan before he was elected Pope, was to retire, and they had a house, he and his brother, Monsignor Georg, and Maria, the sister, would all go back and live there together. Maria came to Rome and ran his household here, but then she died in 1991, and that was a devastating loss because they had envisioned the three of them Georg, Maria, Joseph, living out their lives together. So this very tight-knit family, it wasn't a tight childhood, it was a tight lifetime. Yeah. But then Maria died in 1991.
But for them to provide that encouragement for one another as well.
Sure, and the day before God came for Joseph, we celebrated in the church the Feast of the Holy Family. And Holy Family is one that's truly centered on Jesus, one that tries to help the other members of the family, just like Mary, Jesus, and Joseph did, live out their vocation in the church. And that's exactly what we saw with the Ratzingers. All 5 of them were centered on Jesus, and all 5 of them were helping the others learn how to say fiat or amen or yes to whatever God was asking. What a family.
That's beautiful.
And then we can layer in, too, the beauty of the Catholic faith that they lived in Bavaria, in Marktl am Inn, and then in Traunstein. It was noted that this is about 20 miles or so from 30 kilometers, I think, from Salzburg. And Joseph Ratzinger talked about the fact, the impact of Mozart on his life. He was described by a few writers as the Mozart of theology for the church, given the vast diversity of his talents. But the beauty also of the liturgies, the beauty of the churches, but also the sheer beauty of Bavaria, all left a really deep impact and impression on young Joseph.
I came across something I'd like to read. The earliest written document that we have of Pope Benedict was a letter he wrote to the Christ child back in 1934. It was around Christmas time. And a young Joseph Ratzinger wrote, I'm just going to read this briefly. Dear Christ child, you will soon float down to earth. You want to bring joy to children. You also want to bring me joy. And he wished for a missal, a green mass vestment, and a Jesus heart. And Joseph Ratzinger wrote, I will always be good. And again, his writings obviously advanced much more throughout his life, but there's still this, I sense throughout his life, he still had this simple childlike faith that he maintained throughout.
Unless we become like little children, we won't inherit the kingdom of God, Pope Benedict's boss once said in Galilee. And he kept that until the end. When I look at all that he's done in his papacy, there are so many things that almost no pope will be able to imitate. But one of the things that he did, which I think is emulable by everyone, is the way that he loved to meet with young people. Just at this time of year, during his papacy, all the children of Catholic Action in Italy would come down here to the Vatican and always give a discourse to them, explaining the truths of the faith in ways that every 8-year-old would be able to understand. And so he never lost that childlike simplicity, and that's one of the reasons why we're so hopeful that he is now experiencing the fullness of that kingdom of God for which he was asking even at a tender age.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, with that, I will admit, I am daunted by his intellect. He is this intellectual giant that will be his legacy throughout church history in part. But there are writings that he has that are accessible for us all. Can you speak to that? What would you recommend, Father de Souza? I'll start with you. If someone wants to get to know Pope Benedict XVI in a greater way this week, where should they begin?
Well, I give to children who make their first communion in my parish a Benedict book. Now, it's a children's book, and it's the story, like Father Landry was saying, of children who made their first communion. They came to have an audience, and they asked him questions, and he talks to them about First Communion. And one of the children says, well, how do we know Jesus is there in the bread, in the Eucharist, and we can't see him? And Benedict says, well, you can't see electricity either, but we know it by its fruits. We know whether the light comes on or not. And he had that great capacity. That's for children. I would say that his interview books are a good way in because they're interviews, so he's conversing, so it's not quite so difficult. But I would suggest that you can read his homilies, Christmas homilies, Easter homilies. They're not hard to read, and they're very beautiful. But I will make a pitch for something more difficult. He gave 4 what I've written about called the September speeches. One of them, the famous Regensburg Address, the other one in Westminster, Paris, and Berlin. And there, in a few pages, not in a book form, he lays out a vision of what the social order should be and the role of faith and reason that would rival a graduate level course elsewhere. And in fact, even in the magisterium, you'd be hard-pressed to find it. So I think start wherever you can. Right. Ratzinger, Benedict, is one of those people that once you start reading, you'll want to come back for more, because there's something there for all different levels, and it's so beautiful that you will come back for more. So my advice to viewers is read whatever happens to be around your house, or whatever you search for, read it first, and then start from there.
Father Landry.
So I likewise very highly recommend the interview books that he's done, which are several.
Yeah.
But I love his catecheses on the saints. Pope Benedict really wanted to promote the universal call to holiness in accessible ways. And rather than talk about it as a series of doctrinal propositions, he wanted to show those who had heard the Lord and followed him as much as they could with the help of the Lord. And so his series of catecheses on the saints, which have been published in book form, but if somebody doesn't want to spend any money, just go to Google or go to the Vatican.va website, and you'll be able to read those very human figures who are able to become extraordinary by their doing what Ratzinger himself did, saying a wholehearted yes to the Lord and following through with all their heart and soul.
Matthew.
Yeah, I think you actually suggested something that is worth reading, and that's his letter to our Lord when he was, 7 years old. I say that because one of the aspects that comes through that little passage that you read is he had already established, or was trying to establish, a friendship with Christ. And it's a friendship that continued throughout his life. If you read some of the last of his testament that he published, he talks about the fact that he is preparing, and Father, you alluded to this, to go through the dark door of death. And yet he said, I am prepared because I know the judge on the other side is my friend. So that friendship lasted for 90-some years with him. But if we're looking for actual texts, I would start, in many ways, with the one that I did, or tried to read, and that's the Introduction to Christianity in 1968, written by a very young theologian. He was in his 30s when he wrote it. But it also begins to articulate, I think, so many of his concerns and so many of the themes that populated his writings in the decades to come, especially secularism, the worries of relativism, of where Western civilization was going, and how the Catholic faith provides the answers to that. But then I would also pick up on something that Father Roger said, and that is, go to his general audiences, especially his writings, not just on the saints, but also on the doctors of the church, the women mystics. He named Hildegard of Bingen in 2012 to be a doctor of the church. His little letter that accompanies that is a kind of a beautiful little summary of the mystical life. And then his catechesis, his audiences on prayer, again, little masterpieces that are easily digested.
I must say, we're still in the Christmas season,
right?
And the third of his 3 books on Jesus of Nazareth is a smaller book on basically Christmas and Epiphany and the infancy narratives. And a lot of people I know read that in Advent and Christmas, and there's still time. We got a few days left. So.
And available at EWTN's religious catalog.
Excellent.
I'm sure as well. But you said something, Matthew, about his relationship with God, how he established this relationship with God. I think for those who are academics, if you will, and very bright, maybe can know and study God, but he did both. He studied God, but he knew him. That's really what's been kind of standing out to me as I've been reflecting on Pope Benedict's life these past few days. And we are all called to know, love, and serve the Lord. And knowing him is fundamental and foundational. And it seems like Benedict really modeled that for us all.
In his first encyclical, God is Love, he said in the first paragraph, Christianity is not the result of a whole bunch of ethical ideas, but it's the result of an encounter with a person who we discover is in our life and really deeply loves us. And so for Benedict, he was never studying about Jesus as much as he was getting to know Jesus better and then writing about that encounter in a way that was accessible for other people. The faith for him was about a person rather than about a whole series of ideas, however deep. And that's one of the greatest legacies that he's given us to help us make our faith likewise personal.
Lord, I love you, right? That's what it comes down to.
Can't be more simple than that. I would point out one of the things, when he became Pope, he decided not to do beatifications. John Paul did them all himself. The older tradition was not to do it, so he restored that tradition, so they were done in different parts of the world. He made two exceptions. One is John Paul, because that was here, obviously. Yes. But the one exception was for Cardinal John Henry Newman. He went to Britain to beatify him himself. Partly because John Henry Newman, I'm sure he thought was his friend across the century. But John Henry Newman was again, maybe the most learned man of the 19th century. I don't know how you compare that, but Ratzinger has a claim to be the most learned man of his time. But these two men, they wrote prayers, they wrote devotions, they wrote hymns. They could express the faith in a way that would be very edifying in a parish church. And so I think that's maybe why he went to Britain, because not just he was a scholar, but he was a Ratzinger kind of scholar, or maybe better to say Ratzinger was a Newman kind of scholar.
And kindred spirits in helping to articulate the faith in a secular culture that did not like the faith, that was very opposed to the faith, and yet expressing it beautifully.
Absolutely, and we're going to continue our conversation right after this break. Welcome back to EWTN's special coverage from Rome as we remember Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. We are so grateful to be joined by our first guest, Cardinal George Pell. Served as the inaugural prefect of the Secretariat for the Economy. He's the former Archbishop of Sydney, Australia. Your Eminence, welcome. When did you first meet Pope Benedict?
I think it was about 1990. I was appointed to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So I was still in Melbourne as an auxiliary. So I'd come over for a meeting once a year or so. So I met him when he was prefect of the Doctrine of the Faith.
Wow. And tell us about your interactions with Pope Benedict.
Well, first of all, there was very formal. The material was distributed beforehand. Everyone was supposed to have read it. It was a pretty good group of people. I think they had read the material. Then everyone in turn would speak. I was a junior person. Once he started with me, I think, to see whether I had anything to say myself.
And did you?
And I did. But I don't think I've ever encountered a man who was so good. He would briefly introduce the topic. Then when everybody had spoken, he would synthesize what was said, he would analyze it, and then spell out his position. I've never encountered anyone who was better at that than he was. He was a very formidable intellectual and an enormously well-educated theologian, and in many other areas too.
Your Eminence, you welcomed Pope Benedict to Sydney for World Youth Day. What was that like to have a Pope travel to Australia, and what was the impact that you saw on Australia itself?
Well, I was very pleased. We were delighted in Australia. We're a long way away, of course, to get a Pope to come to us. People were impressed by him. I mean, his early image was totally misleading. It wasn't that he changed. It's just that because he was appearing so frequently in public, people could see that the caricatures about Panzer Cardinal were just wrong. He spoke beautifully. We had more overseas visitors than the Beijing Olympics, which was later in that year. The final Mass was the biggest gathering in Australian history. And of course, the Holy Father was a great man for the liturgy. He insisted that it be prayerful and adoration, and he was enormously successful. I remember being able to hear the birds after communion at the final Mass with 400,000 people with Benedict, which says quite something for the recollection and quiet and peace and prayer of that group.
And there was such a generational divide, it seemed, between Pope Francis and world youth who'd
Yeah,
come to
well,
Australia.
I'm not too much into that. Children get on well with their grandparents.
Well,
and he was a very educated man, and he was used to listening to people, so he could address their problems, and he'd do it clearly and elegantly. But yes, there's a great difference in years, but often young people like their grandparents.
well, they seemed to love him.
They did,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Like the people who are turning up at the moment.
Your Eminence, you mentioned the liturgy, his love for the liturgy. While you're now more known for your economic reforms and the tasks, that one of the major missions you had for the church for about 10 years was working on the translation of the Roman Missal into English, which now, almost 10 years on, the whole English-speaking world uses. For most of that time, it began with John Paul, but it came to fruition under Benedict. You must have had a lot of conversations with him about the liturgy and about that collaboration. What can you share with us, what you learned from him on the liturgy?
Well, I read a lot of his writings on the liturgy. I think from him more than anyone, I learned just how important the liturgy is in maintaining the health of the church. He was a German, and like many Germans, he was very sympathetic towards English speakers, perhaps especially the British. He understood our problems, and he understood the importance of an accurate, non-ideological translation. So first of all, that was when he was at Doctrine of the Faith, on the translation of the Catechism. And then our work was a bit controversial. I mean, well, I think the translation has settled into place now, but he backed us all the way because he understood all we were trying to do was to get an accurate and appropriate translation of what was in the English, in the Latin text.
When you look at Pope Benedict's life as a theologian, what do you think will be his greatest contribution?
That's a very good. I think his greatest contribution is that he fulfilled the job description of Pope, which you find in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John. As Pope, he was the foundation man of the church, the rock man. And the principal role of the Pope is to maintain the purity and clarity of church doctrine so that the people in the pews are being taught what Christ and the apostles taught. And as successor of Peter, he has the power of the keys to rule that something is not compatible with the apostolic tradition. And of course, he's there to strengthen the faith of his brothers and sisters. And I mean, I'm just so pleased that so many tens of thousands of people are streaming past his corpse as it lies in state. These are the people who are speaking, ordinary battlers from the pews, families. People mightn't be perfect, mightn't even be at church every Sunday, but understand the beauty of what we've got in the Catholic Church. They're Benedict's people, and they're here in droves.
Absolutely. I think 65,000 were estimated yesterday.
Which was double what they estimated, what they anticipated.
And nonstop today. It continues tomorrow. When you look at Pope Benedict's writings, what do you think his legacy will be there? What's his greatest writing, in your opinion?
I'm not sure that I could usefully answer that. Perhaps his 3 volumes on Christ. His attempt to reconcile the historical critical method with the tradition of the church and a proper understanding, and making it quite clear that we traditional Christians, we Catholics, for us truth is fundamental. I remember hearing a discussion on the scriptures on the BBC, and all the participants thought that the truth was It was just what had been said that was useful for propaganda purposes. Now, Benedict was totally opposed to that. So he wrote 3 beautiful volumes there, so that might be his greatest contribution. He was remarkable for the extent and variety of his writings.
Your Eminence, what might you suggest about the role of the Catechism? Could anybody else have brought that project out in 6 years' time with the breadth and the beauty of that text?
No, well, there's no one with his capacity. I suspect he's had almost no speechwriters because nobody could write as well as he could. Mind you, there was a lot of very good people. It was an enormous exercise in collegiality, the Catechism. And with the help of computers, they were able to bring in thousands and thousands of comments from around the world. And Cardinal Schönborn worked on it. I mean, he's no mean theologian, scholar himself. But I think the partnership of the then Cardinal Ratzinger and Pope John Paul II was one of the most brilliant in papal history. And a lot of people who grew up under them thought that the papacy was always like that. It's rarely like that.
It was a blessed time to be alive, and you were involved.
It was. It was a great time, a high time in the life of the Church.
It was.
Your Eminence, one of the great concerns of Joseph Ratzinger and then Benedict XVI is the risk, the dangers of secularism, of relativism. Would you talk a little bit about his concerns, because I know that this is something of a concern for you as well?
Yes, well, I think his sermon, when he mentioned the dictatorship of relativism, it's been exemplified now, in which so much of the old liberal consensus is threatened, where in the past we prided ourselves on the freedom of the individual to speak. We almost went, you could say, you almost went to war to defend free speech. And now you've got people who are racing around claiming that they're offended. Well, I mean, if we Catholics tried to close down the discussion every time we were offended, public discussion would be radically reduced. This question of identity, group identity, that what's not important is the truths at issue, but what tribe you come from. I mean, that's a regression. It's not civilization. And he was right to warn about it.
Your Eminence, final question while we have you. Looking back at Pope Benedict's life, what are you most grateful for?
I think I'm most grateful, this is a selfish Australian point of view, for the fact that he came out to us for World Youth Day. I think he's being buried in the chasuble, the vestments that he used in the Sydney World Youth Day. I thought that originally was Australian propaganda, but they assure me that it is right. But if that is the case, I'm absolutely delighted. But he was also a friend, and I was almost surprised how sad I was when he went. I knew I'd miss him, and what is really important, of course, is that the legacy of John Paul the Great and Benedict survives and thrives. Now, there are other traditions to be developed, complementary, that's very good, but they represent an essential strain in Catholicity that is vital for our health. Not always popular, but vitally necessary to be faithful to Christ.
We are so grateful for your insights this week. Thank you for being with us, and our condolences, because it is a loss for all of us. And Cardinal George Pell, thank you so much, Your Eminence.
A pleasure.
Ratzinger.
"5 years after the beginning of the Second World War in the year 1943, The end of the armed conflict started to be felt. On the Eastern Front, Stalin's Russia launched a firm counteroffensive against the Nazi troops that culminated in the Red Army's victory at the Battle of Stalingrad. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the Allies disembarked on the Sicilian coasts, thus commencing the advance of the so-called European fortress. That year, the young Ratzinger turned 16, and together with many of his classmates, he was assigned as a student to an anti-aircraft artillery unit in Munich. On September the 10th, 1944, Joseph's unit was dissolved and they sent him home. But upon arriving, there was a letter waiting for him on the table from the Reich, convoking him for mandatory military service. On September 20th, after an interminable voyage, he arrived at a camp on Austria's border with Hungary, where to his great surprise, he found many of his classmates from the school in Traunstein. At the end of October, Hungary fell into the hands of the Russian army that was inexorably approaching the Austrian border. In the face of this threat, the entire unit dedicated its strength to the construction of anti-tank trenches. Benedict XVI often remembered this as a dark and oppressive period. On the 20th of November, without warning, the unit was dissolved and they sent them home. But the calm didn't last. 3 weeks later, the German army recruited him again and sent him to the infantry barracks in Traunstein, the city where his family lived. The young Ratzinger, recruited against his will from the beginning of the conflict, would never be sent to the front lines, nor would he participate in armed confrontations. In 1945, during a routine march with the infantry, Joseph deserted. With the German defeat and the arrival of the Allies, the Ratzinger family home was converted into a military barracks. With many others, the young Ratzinger was identified as a soldier and made a prisoner of war. After a 3-day march, the group of prisoners arrived at the city of Ulm, where they were imprisoned in a camp with 50,000 other prisoners. Under the elements, day after day, the young Ratzinger admired the majestic profile of the Cathedral of Ulm on the horizon. It was a vision that, as he would remember in his biography, consoled him during this final stage in which he experienced the eternal humanity of the faith. 3 weeks later, the Allies liberated Joseph Ratzinger, and finally, he rejoined his family in Traunstein.
We are joined now by our next guest. We're honored to be joined by Cardinal Timothy Dolan, Archbishop of New York, appointed by Pope Benedict XVI. He also appointed you cardinal and to various dicasteries. Your Eminence, thank you for being here.
Catherine, Matthew, Father Roger, you didn't tell me I was following Pell. My God, your ratings are going to go right down the tube now with me on. What?
Thank you for being here. And
My honor. Thanks for asking.
When did you first meet Pope Benedict?
I'm trying to think. So I was rector here at the North American College, where Father Roger and Father Raymond were two of my students. So that was 94, and I would have met him then.
Okay.
Because he was visible in Rome. He's not the kind of a cardinal that would have shown up for the cocktail parties, but you could see him very often. Yeah. So I would have known him. The first time I had a good conversation with him, one of the years, did we say it was 99 when I asked him to ordain the deacons?
He ordained them in October of 1999.
99. So when I was rector, we would always ask a Roman cardinal to ordain our men deacons. And we asked him, and he said he would be happy to. So he said, would you come over and talk to me about it? And also I was happy to. And then when he arrived about 20 minutes before the ceremony, so I was with him for a while. So those would have been the times I would have first met him. I knew of him who wouldn't,
right,
because of his scholarship, see? So I knew of Father Ratzinger, well, I presume 1972, because when I was a student here, introduction to Christianity was required. So I would have known him then.
Wow, that's incredible. And I understand, I mean, you would come to Rome every 5 years with the bishops in your region, and you'd meet with St. John Paul II. You would have met Ratzinger at the time as well. And then you would come back and you met him when he was Pope. Can you tell us more about those visits in particular?
Well, you're right, Catherine. So look, when I was Archbishop of Milwaukee, one of the years I was there, we had what's called the ad limina, which is when bishops by canon law would come to give an accountability of their apostolate. And so we would have, as a group, the bishops from the region, which for us would have been Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana, we would go to all the dicasteries, all the departments. And we were kind of intimidated going to see Cardinal Ratzinger because the caricature, which now the world knows was inaccurate, that he was kind of distant, a bookworm maybe, and he was pretty didactic. When we went in, he put us at ease and he said, look, he said, I know I'm supposed to talk to you, but the first thing I want to do is listen. And we were very moved by that and the perceptive questions he asked us. He said, can you tell me about this? Can you tell me about that? So that was a very, then my next ad limina, when I was Archbishop of New York, he was Pope.
Okay.
So I met him there with my brother, with the auxiliary bishops of the Archdiocese. So I met him then again for the ad limina. And that was very, and then, so a couple times, 3 of the synods, I've been to 3, 2 of them were with him. And those were, we were talking today about his unique ability to just succinctly summarize things. So he would be there all day. Those are rather arduous. And he would listen, okay, just to the bishops. And then at the end of the day, it was expected that the Pope would kind of give some parting words. And he had this magnificent ability to summarize what he had heard and put it all in perspective, which helped very much. Actually, one of the more intimidating moments in my life was when I came to get to be made a cardinal by him in 2012. And the day before, they said, we're going to have a meeting of all the cardinals, the rookies and the veterans. And they asked me to give a talk, and he's sitting to my left, and on the new evangelization in Italian, so that was doubly difficult. And I would have to say that was, and I can remember, so, and I don't know what, I think it was my upbringing, thanks to the Sisters of Mercy from Ireland who taught me, when you would be called upon for recitation, whether it be a spelling word, a catechism question, you stood up. So when I'm sitting next to him, everybody else, including him, when they spoke, were sitting, I stood up. And when he was done, when I was done, he said to me, oh, you spoke very well. And he said, you were raised well. You stood up to speak. I guess he was raised the same way in the classrooms of Bavaria.
Emeritus, I want to talk to you a little bit about the new evangelization.
I figured you would.
A mind reader, in addition to all your other talents. About a year before he appointed you Archbishop of New York, he was seated in the chair that you now occupy in St. Patrick's Cathedral.
Yes, yeah.
And he gave a beautiful homily there at Mass. But one of the things that he said is the most urgent need that we face in the church is to show the joy of our faith and the experience of love. How do you think Pope Benedict showed that joy and showed that love?
So, yes, and those are themes that his successor, Pope Francis, has elaborated upon in a very, I think, compelling way. He didn't originate it. It came from Pope Benedict. He did it beautifully because, again, the expectation that he was kind of a stern Pope, and he could speak the truth with love. He could speak the truth with love. You and I heard when we were with Carl Anderson, the former Supreme, told us that what he remembered from his reading of Introduction to Christianity was when or was it the Ratzinger report? I forget, that somebody said, well, how do you deal with people who have so many doubts? Because the world seems to doubt the truths of the faith. And he said, well, let's find some common ground. We all have doubts, don't we? Even believers have doubts. We have doubts about the world. We have doubts about secular society. He said, so let's deal with doubts that we all have got them, and how do we resolve the doubts? You bring darkness to the light, and Jesus is the light of the world. He had this unique ability in a very compelling way just to teach the truths of the faith with a sense of joy. Now, he wasn't, I mean, it's tough to think of him, popping a champagne cork. I mean, he was kind of a reserved man, but he did have a quiet sense of joy, didn't he? And it kind of exuded. And his love, can you remember? So who was one of the bitterest critics of Joseph Ratzinger? Hans Kuhn.
Yeah.
Not long after he was elected Pope, Pope Benedict invited. He said, "Come see me. Come let's have a meal together." Now that kind of confidence, that kind of courtesy, that goes a long way.
Yeah.
Didn't help in that regard, but he was very winsome that way.
Well, Your Eminence, you are a great church historian. In particular,
You're good too. Matthew and I have worked on projects together. Yeah.
In particular, in American Catholic history, your doctorate's in it. Could you assess Pope Benedict's and even Joseph Ratzinger's impact on the American church?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think it would be impossible to understand Pope Benedict's magisterium without reference to his predecessors. I remember after he was elected Pope in 2005, the great Archbishop of Chicago, Francis George, said, we cardinals knew we needed someone to help us, he used the word, unpack the magisterium of John Paul II. It's going to be a lot, and we couldn't think of anybody better. So his ability to continue that beautiful magisterium. Secondly, I think most people wouldn't say this, but the alliance, the beautiful symphony between faith and reason. See, faith and reason. So here you have this man of impeccable scholarship and rock-like faith. Now the world goes into bromides saying, either you're a man of reason or you're a man of faith. Never the twain shall meet. If you're a thinker, you're obviously not going to be swallowed by the superstition of faith. And if you're a believer, you don't like reason. Benedict loved to quote Anselm, who said, "Strange would be the God whose greatest natural gift to us, reason, his greatest supernatural gift to us, faith, would be at odds." They're intended to work together in symphony, in concert. He taught that, and I think that was a great lesson to a skeptical American society. I don't know if we got the lesson, because as you look around, and thirdly, I think this would be more anecdotal too, but I think in the way he shattered the caricature. So remember when he was elected, this is the Rottweiler. This was the enforcer, and when he just exuded that courtesy, that joy, that love, that warmth, that interest, he shattered that. That you can be impeccably faithful and also a man of love and joy. I think those are great legacies that he's got.
Eminence, the day he created you a cardinal, he gave you a gift. He gave you a ring in which there was,
and I should have worn it,
an image of St. Peter, St. Paul, and a star that
for the Blessed Mother, the star of evangelization.
Represented Our Lady. Well, talk a little bit about what that gift says about him and how it's impacted you.
It says a lot. Now I'm embarrassed I didn't wear it, although I'm wearing one of St. Joseph, because in honor of him, that is a baptismal patron, and because once Pope Francis invited the world and the church to pray with and for him as his end was coming near, St. Joseph being the patron of a happy death. So I've been wearing this one. But that means a lot. I don't wear it very often. One of the reasons I don't wear it is one time it popped out. And St. Anthony found it in a church, and I got it re-welded, but I'm kind of reluctant to wear it. It means a lot. For one, because other cardinals have it, so I can kind of recognize a classmate, if you would, from the year you were made a cardinal. But secondly, when you think of the Blessed Mothers, the star of evangelization, and Peter and Paul, the first teachers of the pass on the truth of Jesus and his message, that means a lot to me. It says a lot about being a cardinal, your fidelity to the office of Peter and Paul, your love of the Blessed Mother, the Mother of the Word incarnate, the eternal Word. Is that the commercial? Okay.
Your Eminence, thank you so much for
My
your
honor.
insight and helping us to get to know Pope Benedict
Was I more
XVI.
interesting than Cardinal Pell, or what?
It's a tie. It's a total
such
tie.
I figure when I saw him on, I said, well, you've got altitude and width, so you're getting all the dimensions.
We prefer
Did they have
depth.
to widen the camera?
One might
when
almost
I
say the
came
4
on?
cardinal points.
One might say.
Keep up the good work. We need you.
Thank you so much. And we're going to continue our special coverage as we remember Pope Benedict XVI after this break. Welcome back to EWTN special coverage as we remember Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI here in Rome ahead of his funeral on Thursday, January 5th. Very insightful interviews we just had with both Cardinal Pell and Cardinal Dolan, getting more insight into Pope Benedict's life. We also, a little bit earlier, saw a report of the young Joseph Ratzinger growing up in Germany. Matthew, can you address the reality of Nazism and growing up in Germany during that time and the impact that would have had on Ratzinger?
Well, we've talked a lot about the relationship between John Paul II and Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI. One of the things that they most distinctly had in common is that both of them witnessed very firsthand, in different ways, the horrors and the evil of Nazism, of National Socialism. Mm-hmm. We saw in the packages relating to Benedict's life that his family was directly impacted by Nazism. Why? Because as devoted Catholics, they were opposed to it. His father suffered because of it. The family had to move to Traunstein because of that. So from that point on, throughout his life, he was an enemy of National Socialism, Nazism. Mm. And so that's something that always has to be discussed and taken head on in any conversation about him, in part because of the misrepresentations that have been made about his participation in the Hitler Youth and his involvement in the German army.
And can you just clarify and respond to that misunderstanding?
Yeah, the basic misunderstanding is that he was obligated to join the Hitler Youth. He did not participate. He never put on the uniform of the Hitler Youth. And conscripted into the Wehrmacht, into the German army. He did everything he could to avoid it, and at the first opportunity, deserted the German army. So it's very clear that as a young man, both on principle, but also as somebody who recognized truth, who was pursuing truth, he saw the evil of Nazism.
Yeah. And Matthew, you mentioned earlier just the impact the German church would have had on him at the time. Isn't that true, Father Landry, as well, the beauty of the church?
He was able to see full flourishing Catholicism. We had mentioned before a little bit about Cardinal Faulhaber coming when he was 5 and seeing all the ceremonies, all the beauty, the incredible music, the incredible architecture, the great preaching actually in the church in Germany at the time. He grew up with that, and that's why when Nazism came, it was not just a clash between atheism and faith and brutality versus love, but it was also a huge clash between evil and goodness because he had tasted that goodness, that beauty, and that truth as a young boy, so he was much more easily able to see just what a contradiction to everything human, not to mention everything supernatural, was National Socialism.
Absolutely. Father D'Souza, what stands out to you when we look back on his youth and when he first became a priest?
Well, he came to the priesthood in a very difficult path because he had been conscripted. When he left the German army towards the end of the war, at that time it was not just walking away, it was quite courageous, because if you were found, you could be incarcerated or shot. John Paul, on the other side of that war, was in a clandestine seminary, so these two men had unusual paths, to say the least, to the priesthood. But they both saw in the priesthood a juxtaposition to the worldly and wicked sort of visions of how the world could turn out. And so both of them, in this extraordinary friendship they had, or collaboration and then later friendship, were born out of the opposite. They saw evil, beheld evil up close in their youth. And Cardinal Pell's point was a very good one, that period, those 35 years of 1978 to 2013, that's not how the church usually is. You know, that you have a pope of a colossus of history, and his principal collaborator, also a colossus of history. That's not only is it not the way things usually are, it's actually rarely that way. And so in a certain sense, the funeral this week, although 10 years after his departure from the papacy, is the end of an astonishing period in papal history, really one of the most astonishing that will in the full 2,000 years. And to think that those two men, one born in 1920, one born in 1927, were formed in the crucible of what was thought to be perhaps the worst time in the history of Europe, maybe the history of the world, shows you God making all things work together for the good for those who love him.
But isn't it striking how, because of that, the crucible, the two of them so profoundly understood what the 20th century could teach, but also then how to reflect on the isms of the 20th century and to provide the antidotes to it.
There were enormous stakes involved, and they saw that in the sufferings of their own people. They likewise grew to appreciate the real meaning of God's involvement in the world. Pope Benedict had two passages that he referred to more than any other in his papacy. One was Romans 12, in which he was beckoning us to offer ourselves to God. The second was John 12:24. Unless the grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it bears no fruit. But if it dies, it will bear great fruit. And Cardinal Ratzinger, in a particular way, recognized the fruitfulness of suffering when done together with the Lord in his cross. And that's why he was able to preach so beautifully about the cross. When he talked about our own baptism, when he talked about conversion, he said, it's not just a minor course correction in somebody's life. It's not just getting wet. It's a death and a resurrection. And so he lived that and he experienced that in his life, as did St. John Paul II. And they came out on the other side, able to inspire us by those life lessons.
Such an honor to be here and to have lived during that time. And with that, we want to take you to this next report as we get to know the life and legacy more of Joseph Ratzinger and Pope Benedict XVI.
The end of the Second World War generated in the young Ratzinger and his peers a feeling of profound gratitude for their recovered freedom. The little things acquired an extraordinary value, and institutions like the family and friendships were reinforced as a guide for young people that began to dream of a future again. On September the 2nd, 1945, the war ended. During the months that followed, Joseph dedicated the majority of his time to reading philosophical and theological texts. In a Germany destroyed by the war, it wasn't easy to find sufficient and adequate bibliographical resources. But thanks to his parish priest in the library at the minor seminary in Traunstein, he began to be formed ahead of the first big step that lay ahead for him, entry into the seminary of Freising. After Christmas of 1945, despite not being in perfect condition, the seminary opened its doors to a group of 120 seminarians from between 18 and 40 years of age. A mixed group, but one united by a hunger for knowledge and service of the Church. In 1947, the young Ratzinger concluded the cycle of philosophical studies and decided to pursue theological studies at the University of Munich. In 1949, Joseph dedicated his summer holidays that year to working on his PhD thesis. And in October, he received his ordination to the diaconate and had to start preparing for the sacrament of the priesthood at Freising Seminary. Despite the many difficulties, Joseph was able to reconcile the two things, thanks to the help of his classmates at the seminary and his family. Finally, on June the 29th, 1951, Joseph Ratzinger and his brother Georg received the sacrament of Holy Orders at the Cathedral of Freising, a day Benedict XVI would remember on numerous occasions over the course of his pontificate. In 1952, he left Munich and accepted a professorship in the Freising Seminary. A year later, he obtained a doctorate in theology. The next step was his qualification as a university docent. Over the next year, Ratzinger spent his days between responsibilities as a professor, pastoral duties, and preparation for the exam. The topic chosen for the final test was Revelation and Salvation History in Bonaventure, a thesis that some professors saw as extremely revolutionary, and it was only accepted after several changes were made. On January the 1st, 1958, Joseph began his first job as a professor of dogmatics and fundamental theology in the Philosophical and Theological Seminary of Freising. In the summer of that same year, his father died. During the years that followed, Joseph Ratzinger taught in the universities of Bonn, Münster, and Tübingen. With the beginning of the Second Vatican Council in 1962, Cardinal Frings, Archbishop of Cologne and member of the Preparatory Commission, called on Ratzinger as a theological consultant. From that moment until the end of the council in 1965, the young Joseph lived between Rome and Münster. The following years were characterized by the infiltration of Marxism into university environments, including the theology departments, and the University of Tübingen didn't escape the dominant Marxist messianism. 2 years of strong tensions at the university went by, and Ratzinger decided to accept a department chair position at the University of Regensburg, where his brother had already been living since 1963. The first years in Regensburg coincided with determinant moments in Joseph's life. Pope Paul VI called on him to be part of the Pontifical International Theological Commission, and in this same period, Paul VI's Missal was published that almost completely prohibited the use of Pius V's Missal. It was an unprecedented initiative in the history of the liturgy that the young Ratzinger lived with great restlessness. But in general, the years in Regensburg would be a period of fruitful theological work for him. The years went by, and on the Vigil of Pentecost in 1977, Joseph Ratzinger was ordained Archbishop of Munich and Freising in Munich's cathedral. It was a day that he remembered with particular emotion in 2006 during his apostolic voyage in Bavaria. The new Archbishop chose Cooperators of Truth as his episcopal motto. In these few words, he saw a continuity between his mission as professor, theologian, and bishop, all three centered on the search for truth. Benedict XVI would describe the moment of his episcopal consecration as his present, a now that wasn't a memory, but a continuous present of what was and would be his life from that moment on.
Again, it's so insightful to learn more about Pope Benedict XVI. In looking back, and again, we'll be discussing his legacy throughout this week, but I just would like to ask this question to summarize what his legacy would be. What is a phrase that you think will describe Pope Benedict XVI best?
One of his phrases or a phrase about him? There's too many phrases, Catherine, too many phrases.
How do you begin?
Just looking at that picture of his ordination, whenever he reflected on his ordination, he would talk about, at that time, the end of the ritual ordination, which was the bishop, or Cardinal Fallarbor in this case, saying, "I have called you not servants but friends." And in a way, right up to the beginning of his pontificate, Joseph Ratzinger, and then as Pope, proposed that we can be friends with Jesus. Friendship with Jesus, as he said, the most beautiful thing in the world, which for a man of his erudition is an astonishingly simple thing to say. My favorite quotation from Benedict XVI, there's actually two, but I'll give you one, was at the beginning of his pontificate. He was out here behind us 27 years after John Paul's great Be Not Afraid homily. He knew that he wasn't John Paul II, but he also knew that he was his successor and his collaborator. So at the end of that homily, he said, 27 years ago, John Paul was here, and he said, "Be not afraid, open wide the doors to Christ." And he said he was talking about the great world systems, communism and division of the world into blocks. And he said, but isn't it true that each of us is afraid, if we open the door to Christ of our hearts, that he will take something from us, something that makes life true, beautiful, and great? And then he said, I'm an old man, not exactly those words, and I can tell you, after 78 years of being a Christian disciple, I can assure you, young people, that if we let Christ in, he takes nothing of what makes life beautiful, and he gives us everything in return. It was his interpretation, a theological and spiritual key of what his predecessor had said. I think as a college university chaplain, I've quoted that 1,000 times. It's one of the most beautiful things he said. And even to this day, when I am giving a talk and I say it, I feel a bit emotional. That's my favorite memory of his inaugural homily, which in a sense showed that he knew he was John Paul's successor, but he also knew that he was his own man. And he did that very beautifully on that first day.
Yes, thank you for sharing that, Father Landry.
I've already mentioned a little bit earlier in our program what I think the most significant passage in his papacy is, that Christianity is not about an ethical system, not about ideas, but an encounter with a person who comes into our life, shows us how much he loves us. But what I'd love to say is the line that I've used more than anything else is in a beautiful speech he gave December 12th, 2000, to the catechists, to the religious ed instructors from all over the world who had come here to the Vatican for the Jubilee of Catechists. And in it, he preached a beautiful homily where it was the third Sunday of Advent, or Gaudete Sunday, the Sunday of joy. And the gospel is always about St. John the Baptist. And he said, we meet St. John the Baptist at the Jordan River, calling us to change the way we look at things. Metanoete is the Greek word. Turn your head around, convert. And he said, what metanoete means is not just change a little. It means to have a whole different way of looking at the world, that we shouldn't be doing what everybody else says. We shouldn't be copying others. We shouldn't be looking for worldly gurus. But in fact, we should be turning to Christ, who doesn't just point us on the way to live, but he says, I am that path. And so when you look at his life, he was someone who totally believed Jesus when Jesus said, I am the way, come follow me. And his entire priestly life, his entire pontificate was try to get us on that same pilgrimage he was walking, following in Jesus' footsteps all the way to the Father's house.
And he did just that, Matthew.
I think there are many, many phrases we're all realizing tonight, but two jump to mind. The first is from the inaugural homily, and that is that there's two little phrases that he uses. The church is young, the church is alive. And you read that passage earlier that I want to go back to, where he's writing to the Christ child.
Yes.
He kept that sense of youngness, that it was always fresh. But also, he was reminding the church and the world that the church is alive. And only by proclaiming Christ Jesus can we find true life. But the other phrase that he uttered on the loggia behind us here, on the night of his election, is that he described himself as a humble worker in the vineyard of the Lord. So it implies two interesting things, I think. The first is that he recognized that he was a worker in the vineyard. So he was not shy from the labor that was involved, and he showed that in the decades as prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, as a cardinal, as a priest, as a bishop. But then also, the word that's used so often now, when we really understand who he was, who Joseph Ratzinger was, is humility. There is a humbleness, a humility in him of that obedience to truth, the truth that he pursued throughout his whole life.
Absolutely, and I look forward to discussing that further. You know, one thing I'd like to ask is, as we're all, the global Catholic Church, preparing for this historic event, the funeral on Thursday, what advice might you have for our viewers at home about how, if they cannot attend, if they cannot be here at St. Peter's, how might they spiritually prepare? Because, again, this is a global historic event, and though most of us have never met and had personal encounters with Pope Benedict, we're all grieving his loss. He was our Holy Father.
Pope Benedict himself would say that the first thing we always do as Catholics, no matter what challenge we're facing, is to pray, that we turn to God first. And as he wrote in his spiritual testament, which has just been published, he begged for all of us to pray for him, that as he went to face the Lord, he would find the Lord in the fullness of his mercy. And so the best thing we do as Catholics is we pray together. And what we're going to experience on Thursday morning is the Church Universal praying in unison after the example and according to the explicit request of the 265th Peter. And so I would say that we pray in a spirit of prayer, asking the Holy Spirit's help, because if we say, Holy Spirit, I don't really know how to pray this funeral mass in my own living room, we're already praying well.
There we are. We're in conversation.
I would suggest two practical things. A lot of parishes and dioceses are having masses on Wednesday evening. With the time difference, of course, the funeral mass will be very early in the morning back in North America. If you can get to one of those Wednesday evening masses, it's a parish mass, it might be a cathedral mass if your bishop is there. That's a beautiful way to unite yourself to this prayer. And secondly, I would go back and I would read the homily that Cardinal Ratzinger preached for the funeral of John Paul II. It's him analyzing history, but analyzing history through the life of one man who was a Christian disciple. And of course, he built that homily around two very simple words from John 21, follow me, which I presume will be the gospel on Thursday. I don't actually know, I haven't researched that, but I presume it'll be used again. So if you can get to one of those masses, that would be great. And I would reread the homily that Ratzinger gave for John Paul's funeral.
Great advice. Matthew, we have about a minute
Yeah,
left.
very, very briefly. Go to ncregister.com and catholicnewsagency.com. It sounds like a shameless self-promotion, but EWTN News. Read so many of the commentaries, including by these two, on the life and the legacy of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. It is an edifying read. And then tune in for the funeral and watch it.
Absolutely. Again, this will be a unique historic event, and it can be broadcast throughout the globe as well. Thank you for being here with me, gentlemen, and as we get to know Pope Benedict XVI even more, I feel like I've learned about him more because of you. Thank you so much.
Most
that
welcome.
Concludes tonight's special coverage of EWTN, remembering Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, but we'll be right back here tomorrow. We will be here for the Wednesday general audience and again in the evening for another special program. Make sure to go to EWTN.com/Benedict to find out all the details. Until then, we'll see you there.